this day. But who was the man behind the music? Who was this guy in the background who was also really in the forefront? The man whose sound has resonated with so many young musicians for decades? Well, tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to dive into those and other juicy questions and get a sampling of Blakey's musical bounty to boot. We will be aided in this endeavor by three men who knew Blakey well, two of them as members of Blakey's famous Jazz Messengers Big Band, educator and saxophonist Bill Pierce, and road manager, second drummer in the Jazz Messengers Big Band, and foremost authority on Art Blakey and his music, John Ramsay. This conversation will be moderated by the third gentleman in that knowledgeable triumvirate, Mr. Yawu Miller, who is not only a writer, journalist, and editor at the Bay State Banner, but is also the nephew of Art Blakey. Yawu Miller, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Reggie.
Absolutely.
And really happy to be here with everybody, and very excited to get into this conversation with Bill Pierce and with John Ramsay. And want to hear your stories and share stories, and let's keep it clean. Let's take it to, let's just start with Bill. Take it from the beginning. Bill, could you talk about how did you first meet Art? What was it like joining his band?
There's so many stories in my life about music and musicians in general, and Art Blakey is no exception. I forgot to even mention, maybe John doesn't even know, but once when I was a student still in college, I went down to see Art Blakey, because I used to see him all the time at the Jazz Workshop, in a lot of different bands. And one night, this guy, as this midget, and some people call him, but he wasn't a midget, but a little short, stocky guy came and grabbed me by my arm. And anybody who knows the power of Art's hands knows that when he grabs you, you don't go anywhere, because he was like pretty much superhuman in terms of his strength. And he dragged me, he was pulling me through the club back to the dressing room. I kept saying, what is this guy doing? And he got there, and the band was in the back. There was a little dressing room right on the side of the stage at the Jazz Workshop. And he said, fellas, look at this. Look at this guy. Who does he look like? And I guess in Art's eyes, I looked like Stanley Clarke. And then, especially in those days, because I had a big afro, and I was tall and skinny, still kind of tall and skinny. And I forgot about that story. And I was just like, I was shocked, because I was in awe that I was even around this guy. And I never asked him about that. You know, and that probably would have been, oh man, that could have been 10 years before I joined the band. And I kind of forgot about it, like a lot of memories come back. But then I used to go see Art's bands a lot, and I knew guys in the band, Ramon Morris, tenor player. I knew different guys, David Snitter, I got to know different guys. So I would go see the band, and James Williams, one of my best friends, got in the band, and he kept talking me up to Art. So eventually Art said, well, let's hear him. If he's all that good, then we should hear him. And that's basically how I got in the band. That's how I met him. But I didn't meet him, you know, like I said, 10 years ago. He never had that conversation with him about that. And man, it was a great 3 years, you know. Not a contradiction, but actually I was a part of the big band, but I really was in the sextet most of my tenure with Art Blakey. I was in a small band.
So from 1980
almost 1983, 3 years.
Yeah.
I put in 3 good years. I went back to straight life, so to speak, almost at the end of 1982. So 80, 81, 82.
John, what's your story with Art? How did you become a messenger?
Hey, hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. Great to hear Reggie. Reggie, I think you said it all right there in that poem. But Bill, no, you never had told me that story. But
yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, that's a good one. My first meeting with Art Blakey was an interesting one, and I have to give a little backstory to the first meeting, because it's interesting as well. I was a student at UMass Amherst out in Western Massachusetts, where I'm from, and I had the good fortune of being in an ensemble that Max Roach directed. And, you know, I was kind of the local kid that he took a liking to and was fond of. And I was playing drums in the ensemble one time when he was directing, and he came up behind me as I sat at the drums, and he said, no, 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 don't play it like that. He said, play it more like Art Blakey would play it. And in my self-taught early youth, I turned around, I looked at Mr. Roach, and I said, Mr. Roach, I never heard Art Blakey. And he really literally jumped back in shock. And he said, what? He said, man, you better get busy. And so I went out and bought my first Art Blakey record. Shortly after that was Buhena, which had John Hendricks on it. But within the next 5 years, I'd say 4 years later, I was fortunate to get a gig in Vermont, of all places, backing up Sonny Stitt in the rhythm section with Sonny Stitt. And it was in the town where Art Blakey's son, Gamal Buhena, lived. In fact, we stayed at Gamal's house during the 2-week gig. And it was at that time that I met Art's son, Gamal, who at the time said to me, you remind me of my father. And I was like, what are you smoking, man? And at any rate, the gig ended there. A few months later, I get a call. I went back to Northampton, Mass, where I was living. A few months later, I get a call from Gamal. He says, my father's starting a big band, and he wants to use 2 drummers, and I want you to audition. And of course, my heart took a leap, and I was like, what? Anyways, I asked him, well, who else is auditioning? He said Michael Carvin and Keith Copeland. And those were like 2 guys who were really already established in the New York scene. So I didn't hold out much hope of getting the gig. But long story short, I ended up at the audition at the Black Bean Studios in New York City. It was owned by or run by a drummer from Brazil named Dom Ramau, I believe was his name. And I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly. But anyways, so I drove down to the Black Bean Studio as instructed to do so. And went inside, and the band was already on the stage rehearsing. It was Billy, it was Wynton Marsalis, Branford Marsalis, 2 sets of brothers, Kevin Eubanks, Robin Eubanks, James Williams, Charles Fambro on bass, Valerie Ponomarev, and the musical director at that time was Bobby Watson. And so I came in and quietly took a seat, and Bobby Watson said, hey, are you John? I said, yeah. So there was a drum set up on the stage, but Art wasn't there, and the band was just kind of going through, sectionals, horn sections and stuff. So I sat down at the chair and started to listen. And I think the tune they were playing was a Bobby Watson composition called Wheel Within a Wheel. It's one of your favorites, I know, Yawu. And anyways, a few minutes went by, and then I'll never forget this. It was like the door blew open, and it was fairly dark in the rehearsal studio. But when the door blew open, the sun came beaming in behind the door, and there was this little guy standing in the doorway, but he really filled the entire doorway. He had a huge aura around him, and the first words out of his mouth were, "Where's John?" And so here I am. He said, "John, don't you worry about a thing. You have arrived. Get up there and play. You're with me now. If you make a mistake, make it loud." So there I was. I had been listening to the tune, so I could kind of, do okay with sight unseen, just jumping up on the drums and playing the tune. And in the meantime, Gamal, who was the road manager for the big band, and his buddy David Bardis were bringing in Art's drums and setting them up next to the other set of drums on the stage. And so Art is kind of nodding his approval, and I didn't get kicked out, long story short, and I ended up getting the gig. So, but that was very meaningful, the way he set me at ease. And he did this with everybody. He said, don't worry about it. If you make a mistake, make it loud, so you never make it again. And he had a way, this was his quality of being a leader, or as a leader, was he knew how to get the best out of people. He didn't make them uptight or intimidate them in any way. And he really, he knew how to get the best out of you. And that was one of his qualities.
Yep.
I want to get back to Bill for a second. You just playing off of what you said, John. in Winton's poem, he said, "I empower innovation." Bill, can you talk about what it was like to solo with Art on the drums? Like, what, you know, how did he empower innovation? How did he get the best out of you? What was it? What did
Well,
it feel like? You know?
it was really like being in front of a locomotive a lot. And it was you basically holding on, at least initially, until you learn how to play with him and how to pace yourself in a way that allows him to play what he likes to play and the way he likes to accompany people. And how to learn how to construct a solo and how to build it that has highs and lows, peaks and valleys. And he talked about that sometimes. He would tell you, he said, you know, hold back, or, you know, the first chorus, you know, just kind of, you know, pick and choose, you know, and then open up, as he would say, for the second chorus, because I'm going to open up, so you better be ready. So he could propel you. I mean, in the sense, like all good drummers, at least the drummers that I like, will actually kind of force the issue. Not always, but generally the drums is the focal point of a band. And Art Blakey definitely took that to heart. He would kind of sometimes put you in places where you might not have wanted to be, but it would get the best out of you. He would make you come out of, if you were in a shell on any level, you would either stay in the shell or you would get out of it. You'd learn how to survive and how to use what Art had to make your own statement, or whatever you want to call it, more compelling to the audience. And I played with a lot of really, really great drummers. And two of them they didn't even sound alike, but they had the same spirit. And that was Tony Williams and Art Blakey. And they really had they really believed in the drums should be in the front. Even if Tony said it, Art may not have said it all the time. But that's fine by me. That's how I hear it too. But just to play with guys who had that much control of their own universe, their own world, in terms of the drums, in terms of the dynamics, from playing super, super soft to unbelievably loud and expressive and explosive. So that, you know, Art used to always, he had a thing, he used to say, cover, which means be careful, because in certain nights he would tell you, say, I'm feeling good tonight, fellas, better be ready. And he meant it. Because some nights Art would, even if you felt bad, Art started playing, you wouldn't feel bad. You didn't have time to feel bad. You just feel great because you had this energy behind you, this life force. It really was a life force. And it basically was just reflective of who Art Blakey was. You know, he was a guy from the Depression, and if it's true, if we're led to believe what he says, he was working in the coal mines when he was 2 years old. but he came from the real school of hard knocks. So getting on the bandstand wasn't something to be taken lightly. And there was one thing, I'll say this now while I'm thinking about it, that he always used to talk about lifting the bandstand. And by that, he meant when you're on the bandstand, you want you to play with the intensity and the focus, that you elevate, the musicians elevate themselves and the audience, but he called it lifting the bandstand. And I had never heard that before I joined Art's band. And then I said, I was thinking, boy, that's a hell of a concept. And that's a hell of a way to think about what you do. So Art didn't take the music for granted. He knew the power of the music, and he knew what it can do for people. And I saw it happen so many times. You know, Art could almost get any audience. We played sometimes as the weirdest places in Europe, in the middle of nowhere, Finland. And some point, even if there was a stale audience, they're all farmers and they're thinking about cows or whatever, that Art would get them. He would get one tune. Once he got them, he got them. You know, once he grabbed something that they could grab a hold to. It's about expression and humanity. It's so many things. I mean, it's really hard to codify all the different attributes of Art Blakey.
Yeah. John, you learned a lot about drumming with Art. In fact, you literally wrote the book about Art's drumming. Can you talk a little bit about his method of instruction? How did he impart his vast knowledge of music to you and to other people?
Yeah, but just to follow on what Bill was saying, I remember Art saying that a good solo should be like a good story. It should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yep. And I was also reminded of a story that Benny Golson told me and Javon Jackson when we visited Art in the hospital. Benny Golson said when he first started to play with Art, he was just subbing, I think maybe for Hank Mobley. Bill could confirm that. But Benny was just subbing. He did a week at the Half Note or somewhere in New York. And he said, you know, in those days, he was practicing long tones and trying to get a pretty sound. And he was up on the bandstand with Art and he started playing some of those long tones. And he said, Art played that big old press roll of his and came out and crashed the cymbal and yelled at Benny, "Get up out of that hole." So I think that's a little bit of what Bill was talking about having a locomotive behind you. But I think Art instructed us in just about everything that he did and said. And I mean, he was always teaching, whether it was his little maxims or witticisms that he would often say. For example, you'll never see an armored car following a hearse. He had a lot of teaching in him, although he would state from time to time that he wasn't a teacher. But as far as specific to things that he showed me on the drums, he would always kind of drop little hints more than direct information. For example, one time when I was the road manager, you know, I wasn't playing that much, but Art would frequently get up from the drums at the end of a set and go up to the microphone to introduce the band and the band members. And I would sneak out and jump on the drums and just play behind him while he was on the microphone. And of course, as soon as he stopped talking, the intensity would build up and the band would get louder. And so this one particular time, I remember he got off the mic and he let me go for a ways and I started bashing harder and the band started playing harder and I started working harder and he came up, leaned over me, took one stick. He said, "Nah, John, that ain't the way you build the intensity." And he just took his stick and moved using the same amount of effort, moved from playing in the middle of the cymbal out towards the edge of the cymbal where the cymbal has the most, it builds up the most. And there's the most overtones. And it was just a simple movement of like 2 or 3 inches to, you know, to show me that you don't have to work so hard. You just need to move your stick to this part of the cymbal and it's going to lift the intensity just from that change of timbre, so to speak. So those were, you know, that's a direct sort of drum lesson. There's the story of the 1369 that Bill knows very well. 1369 was a jazz club over in Cambridge that Art came up to receive an honorary doctorate from Berklee one year. And of course, he wanted to hang out at night. So Billy and I took him out to the 1369 Jazz Club. And of course, the owner of the club wanted to meet him. So we all ended up down in the office in the basement of the club, which is pretty much right under the stage. And so we're down there chatting in the office and I decided I need to go up to the bar and get a drink. So I went up the dark stairways, which goes right by the bandstand. I grabbed a beer or something. I was walking back to go back downstairs and the drummer, may he rest in peace, Grover Mooney, said, "Hey, Ramsay, you want to sit in?" I think it was a jam session that night. And so I said, "Yeah, sure." So I sat in, I played a couple of tunes. Now, unbeknownst to me, Billy told me this later, he said that when I was playing down in the basement, right through the floorboards, Billy said that Art leaned over to him and said, "Billy, who's that playing up there? Sounds like John." Right, which he heard through the rafters, right? And so I finished playing. I went back downstairs. I sat down next to Art, and he did one of his moments where he just leaned over. He said, "John, you know, when you play, you don't have to prove nothing. All you got to do is swing." So there again, one of the most profound, impacts on a person that it could ever have. I mean, he heard in my playing something that I'd been doing for years, which was trying too hard or trying to force things. And with that one little observation of his, it was like, yeah, you don't have to prove anything. You just have to make the music feel good. You just have to swing. So he had many ways of teaching, many things that he taught us. As a road manager, of course, he was imparting the little business sort of knowledge that he did have. I had to work with all the local agents that were booked through Jack Whittemore's office in New York. For every country we went to, there was a main booker for the country, and then for every little town that you went to in that country, there was the town booker. And so there was a lot of I learned a lot about touring and the business and that side of things from Art too. John, you're supposed to have at least $1,500 in your pocket at all times. I'm like, where am I going to get it? But he was I think he was an eternal teacher. I mean, Bill, I'm sure there were other musical or non-musical pieces of wisdom that Art must have imparted to you.
Oh, yes.
I want to share one that that you guys probably heard. I mean, there's different versions of the story that Art told, but he was a valet for Chick Webb,
right?
And Chick was was like his mentor. That Art kind of adopted him as his mentor, and he begged Chick to see him play so he could critique his playing. And Art was doing this thing where you hit the drums and the sticks go up in there, you catch them, he's putting on a show. And at the end of the gig, Chick said, he said, the rhythm's not in the skin, and not in the air, it's on the skins. He's told different versions of that story, but I mean, it seems like back in the days, maybe that's the way people just learn from each other. It was like a real short sentence that kind of sums a lot of stuff up,
Yeah. That reminds me of every time I would get antsy and want to get back to playing and get off the road and get away from Art Blakey, I'd say, Art, I got to go. He said, John, I was Chick Webb's valet. You stay right where you are. The important thing is to have the information. And then he would have me hooked for another 6 months,
So both you guys came on as Art was putting together his big band. This is like the legendary big band in 1980. It was the super band. You guys talk a little bit about his relationship to big bands. Wait,
what did Bill say? Bill?
Well, no, I had joined the band as a sextet I joined the band in January. And the Art always wanted a big band, so I can tag on what you're saying. So, because in my mind, it dawned on me one day that really that's what Art always really wanted. He still wanted, I guess he had unfinished business left over from Billy Eckstein or something like that. Or, God, he played, who's the other band he was with?
Fletcher Henderson.
Fletcher Henderson, which I don't think that lasts too long. I think Art was a little bit undisciplined. I don't know what happened, but I can imagine, because from what I heard, Fletcher Henderson was kind of a very refined, sedate kind of guy. And that's not Art. But when I joined the band, so it was a sextet, and it was Valerie Ponomareff and Bobby Watchman. But Art had started talking about the big band even in the first month or two, because the festival season, which was always a big part of the jazz musicians' itinerary in the summer, that's where a lot of guys, some guys, they made all the money they made to live the whole next year from, because all the festivals in Europe and in Asia. And so I guess Art must have been sounding or talking to his main agent in Europe, a guy from the Netherlands called Wim Vick, and about this big band. So I was hearing about it, but I had already started to realize that Art had a lot of stories, and some of them were very factual, and some of them were very fantastical. That's not the right word, but
questionable.
Yeah, well, questionable is more accurate. So but that happened a few times. I remember Art telling me about, yeah, you know, when I get the big band, I'm going to have lights in the drums, and I play my solo, and the lights will go off, and I was like, this sounds kind of crazy. and at that time, I realized that sometimes Art could exaggerate. You know, you have other words for that. You know what I mean? But more and more, this big band thing was starting to come together, and so that's basically how Winton made his first presence known. And consequently, Branford too, really. Winton, Branford, a lot of people in that band, Kevin and Robin, that was everybody's big shot. I had already been in the band. And it happened. We actually did it, which was amazing to me. We did it, and I think Art was truly happy. I think he always really saw himself as a leader of a big band, but as this financially, it wasn't feasible. I mean, he was pretty happy, and he did it. Not only did he do it during that time, he did it one other time after my departure. Matter of fact, right after I left, he had another big band. You know, and that was with Ralph Peterson and a bunch of other guys. But that always was his fallback, kind of his dream project. And he did it a few times, but I think it informed a lot of how he played. And even the sextet, which was very much like a very condensed version of a big band. And Art, people always talk about Art was loud, but Art wasn't loud. He was loud all the time. Art had a complete dynamic range from the very softest to the most explosive. So that only works it works with a large ensemble, but even with a sextet, it can work. And if you listen to the records of the band with Freddie and Wayne and Curtis Fuller, there's so much of the stylistic sort of aspects of a big band in that small 6-piece band. And I think he's still, you know, he's a guy from that period of time. He was a young man in the 40s. And that's where big bands were at their peak. And even the big bebop band like Billy Eckstone's band. But I think that informed a lot of how he played. And when Art played ballads behind the individual guys, his dynamics were superb. I mean, and when he did he's one of the best trio drummers I've ever heard in terms of how his shading and his contrast and how to set up music with just piano, bass, and drums was unbelievable. How he could do it. He was a complete musician.
Yeah. Let's go back in time a little bit to 1959. Blakey had started the Messengers in like about 1955, and 1959 is sort of like when a lot of people say it came together for him. And one of the signature tunes of the Messengers was "Moanin'." It was written by pianist Bobby Timmons. He played that melody between sets, and then Benny Golson, who really helped Art kind of fine tune the signature tunes, the sound of the Messengers. He suggested, he told Timmons, put a bridge on that tune, make it into a song. Let's listen to a clip of "Moaning" from 19.
Yeah, well, can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, number one, Art Blakey's beat, his shuffle beat, you could drive a truck through that beat. It's so big. That he's amazing. I just remembered something about the origin of the Messengers. The Messengers actually was a big band, I think maybe of Muslim musicians back in the 40s.
17 Messengers, yeah.
17 Messages. I forgot about that.
Yeah, because
And-
Art was a Muslim too. He was an Ahmadiyya
Well,
Muslim.
yeah, sure,
Yeah.
he sure was. But because I think Idris Suleiman was in that band. There was a lot of guys in that band. Who? Well,
Sahib, Sahab.
Maybe, but I know
Yeah.
Idris Suleiman
Sahab.
certainly was in there. So that band didn't really exist, but so much. And one other thing, that Art and Horace kind of shared the Jazz Messengers for one brief moment. You know what I'm saying? Because that record kind of, I don't know how there was something maybe that they were trying to decide, because there's a record called Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, or Horace Silver and the
I
Messengers.
think, yeah, it started off as a collective, because I asked
It
Horace
started off
about
as a
that.
collective, right? With both
And
guys.
I think Art's personality was just too big for a
For
collective.
Horace. Yeah, well, that's true. That just popped into my head. Just because there's people out there probably say, "Wait a minute, I know the real story." No, but I know that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a question for Bill. I want to talk a little bit too about what I think, how I think playing in big bands kind of shaped Art's small group style. But Bill, you were talking about the formation of the big band with Winton and Branford. And I know that, you know, a lot of guys will bring other guys to Art to sit in or whatever. Who brought Winton and Branford and Kevin and Robin to Art for them to join the big band? Was it?
I don't want to go too deep into that, but Winton had been sitting in with the band.
Okay.
Because before I joined the band, James was saying, "Man, there's this young kid down here in New York who's playing the hell out of the trumpet."
Right.
And that was Winton. And at that time, Branford was a student in my class.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't my private student, but he wanted to, well, he said he wanted to sit around, but he was in my lecture class. And that's another story. And actually, and then the reason why Branford got in the band, because I made the mistake of telling Bobby Watson that I had a baritone. And so Branford came to me and I was like, "Oh man, I don't know lend my horn to anybody, especially this wild guy." And so I said, "Look, I'm not going to hold anybody back from this opportunity, but I want my horn back the way I'm given to." And of course, Branford tore my horn up.
Yeah, he dropped it or something.
Yeah, he threw it up in the air. He grabbed it by the strap, and the strap broke, and the horn. I'm on the phone getting yelled at by somebody. I can't remember who. And I'm looking at the phone book, and I see my baritone like flying across the concourse. And I was like, "Oh, geez," you know. But to Branford's credit, he got my horn fixed better than it was when I gave it to him. I don't think Branford made any money on that tour. It all went back into fixing my horn. But yeah, so Bobby was really instrumental in getting Winton. Winton probably brought Branford. I'm not sure exactly how the Eubanks brothers got in there, but it was all those. Kevin was at Berklee at the time, or had just left Berklee.
Yeah.
Robin, I'm not sure Robin worked, but so it was, the word of mouth kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was interesting. We had two sets of brothers in the band.
I think what Billy said about Art's dynamic range is really right, very true and very important. In fact, Art would talk about one level of dynamics. I won't use the words he used, but he would talk about being able to hear rats peeing on cotton. That's how quiet you would play.
I kept trying to hold that back, Jim.
Yeah, well, you can rephrase things, Bill. But I think, having played in a number of big bands, I can see that Art's approach to small group really was born out of the big band, in particular in that when you play in a big band and you're the drummer and you're coming up to what we call an ensemble passage, which is where the whole 17 or 18 piece band plays in unison. I mean, that's one of the most powerful sounds you'll ever hear. I mean, you can talk about, rock and roll and Jimi Hendrix and the wall of sound with the 5 Marshall amplifiers, but you stand in front of a big band of 17 or 18 brass and woodwind instruments, putting air through horns, and that'll move you. Yeah. But it's the job of the drummer in the big band to set up those ensemble passages or to lead into them so that everybody is right there and they come in the exact right moment. And so Art's approach to drumming was the same in the small group, that he would set up figures and embellish and reinforce ensemble figures in the way that you would do that in a big band. And I think that had a big impact on the way that he played. And I mean, Billy Eckstein being the main, if you watch some of the videos of that band, he was already a fully formed, big band drummer and was, I mean, there wasn't anything missing. His fills, his setups, his lead-ins, they were already remarkable for a 17-year-old kid, right?
Yeah.
So that's just my 2 cents on his big band background and how it impacted. And then I think you heard that the more horns he had in the band, we just saw Benny Golson and Lee Morgan, that's 2 horns, but I think the more often you had 3 horns, tenor, trumpet, and alto, or 4 horns, like when Wayne Shorter was in the band, Curtis Fuller was in the band. Again, it was that kind of frontline horn section that defined the jazz messenger sound, I think. And
right, the big band DNA was always in him, even when he had a sextet. When you listen to the album Moanin', it sounds like big band arrangements. One thing that I found was kind of interesting about him is like that he would kind of impart that to the musical director. He'd be like, he didn't read music. He was very much self-taught, and he learned from playing with other people and, sort of learned in a very organic way. But he could kind of sing out the parts. Like he'd say the horn should come in and do this, to kind of sing out the parts. And like he had a very precise idea of like what the sound he wanted to achieve.
Yeah, he would chastise guys if they were just standing around listening to the other guy's solo. He would chastise them, say, come up with some backgrounds, come up with some shout choruses, you're not supposed to just be standing there, contribute. So yeah, a lot of, shout choruses and backgrounds, and those are all from big band style.
And Benny Golson took credit for basically organizing the Messengers as more of as a cohesive musical group, uniforms, the whole deal. No, not just a jam session like a night at Birdland with Clifford Brown and that band, but having a repertoire that identifies the band, wearing uniforms, as you see with that band right there with when they did Moanin'. That was an outgrowth of some of the, according to Benny Golson, some of the conversations that he had with Art. Say, look, man, we can do something with this. We can make this into something that can be a real presentation. It won't be just a bunch of guys that are calling tunes and just playing. We can have music that's identified, and it looked how well it worked. I mean, Moanin', that typifies, or at least for a lot of people, that does typify Art Blakey. Moanin', what else? Blues March, all those things.
Blues March, those 3 came in under Benny's thing, and they stayed like
Benny and Bobby Timmons, and we played those 3 tunes pretty much every night. And even with the last band that was a tribute band to some degree with Ralph Peterson, we had the War Horses, as we call them, and we tried to get away from them, but you had to play at least 1 or 2. You had to play 1 or 2.
That stuff kept coming up. So
people loved it. People still love it.
Yeah, you're in your era though. I want to say that Bobby Watson was producing some hits. Like he was writing a lot of stuff.
He was the most, after some of the early, after Wayne and I guess Bobby Timmons and Benny Golson. Bobby was a pretty prolific guy, but James Williams wasn't in his songs either.
Okay.
James Williams wrote a lot of tunes, but Bobby kind of saw himself as a composer anyway, as well as an alto player. So that's actually, Bobby wasn't the straight out musical director, but he kind of was. It wasn't really that identified until once James left and Bobby was still there, then he definitely was the musical director. But they had a kind of a shared sort, but it was really Bobby. It was always really Bobby, because Bobby was writing music all the time, and he still does, of course.
Let's cue up Bitter Dose, because that's that same era.
And that's Bobby. And that's
can we, can we get that? Can we have a listen to that, Reggie?
Yep, I'll find it right now.
Is it Bitter Dose?
Yeah, Benny Golson told me that same story. Javon and I told us that story of how when he was actually subbing again, and Art asked him to go down to Philadelphia. He said, I need you to fill in for a week for me down in Philadelphia. Hank can't make it or something like that. He said, all the time, he said, Art was reeling him in with that groove and that beat.
Yeah.
And he told Art, he said, you could have your own band. We could have your whole thing. And I said, yeah, what do we have to do? Benny said, everything I tell you to do. And he said he doesn't know how, but he said, but Art agreed to it. And that's how they started. So what are we listening to?
Bitter Dose.
John, where's my case?
Watson, Dr. Watson.
Bobby Watson and James Williams and Valerie Palomalo.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the band I remember. My history with the Messengers, I was, a toddler, when I first went into the jazz workshop. I remember one time my brother got on the drums and I started singing, and it must have been Fred Taylor or somebody like grabbed us off the stage.
Yeah.
But it was always a part of my art and his music was always in the household. And then when I got into my late teens and early 20s, when I started actually listening to this, so that was like really listening to the music and hearing you guys, and so but it's always been a part of like Blakey's music, and his style's always been part of my life.
Well, can I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
Let's come back to that 1980s era big band.
Absolutely.
But there's I guess I'll call it a middle period. We're talking about compositions, and the band with Wayne and Freddie, I think is worth spending a little bit of time on talking about, and then maybe showing a little bit of, because I think that was another real high point for the Jazz Messengers. Wayne actually came on when Lee Morgan was still there, but I'm talking about
right after
yeah, so
after Mobley, but also after Benny Golson, like
yeah.
Right, yeah, and then of course Reggie Workman was on bass for a while, and Cedar Walton I think contributed to the book as well. Is that right, Bill?
Yes, very much so.
Wayne gave me a stack of tunes like that once when we were in LA that Art had asked him for, of all tunes that they had recorded, Wayne Shorter tunes that the Jazz Messengers had recorded, and it was a good stack of I don't know, 30, 40 pages of music. So let's talk about that band a little bit. That was
well, can we just play a little bit of the clip we have, because
want to play Caravan?
Yeah.
And then we'll talk about
that one up.
And that
Yes, I can get that. Just a minute.
Yeah, that album Free for All was that same band.
Yeah.
Which was monumental. I mean, talk about hits from that, Pensativa and Free for All, and
people still play those songs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was another pinnacle of musical mastery for me. I mean,
here's Caravan. Again, we hear that big band sound. I mean, this is
Yep.
when the trombone came in, and Curtis Fuller came in the band, and you know, it's 6 pieces, but I mean, when you hear it, you know, if you're not paying attention, you thinking you're listening to a lot more cats on the bandstand.
Yeah, and you know something that struck my attention that I've forgotten about? We looked at 3 different versions of Art's bands. Didn't see any music anywhere. We never were allowed to read music, to look at music on the stage. That was one of Art's rules. No music on the stand. Learn the music, memorize the music. Because yeah, you just couldn't do that.
Yeah, I think, John, you learned that the hard way.
You couldn't bring any music on the bandstand.
Yeah, when I had to learn, you know, 20, 25 tunes in 3 days, I sketched out my own drum parts. Of course, there were no drum parts. And then our opening gig, you remember, Bill, was at the Bottom Line, was it, in New York?
Yep, yes.
Debut of the big band. And so actually a couple of the guys had music, I think, but Art allowed it probably because it was the first gig. But I had my charts on a chair next to to my drum seat because there were no music stands to go around. And so I had my little just sketch sheets of, you know, form and figures here and there to look at. And I remember after we played about 2 or 3 tunes, Art got up from the drums, walked behind me, went to the microphone, introduced the band, and then came off the mic and said, "Play, John." And he had called, what was that tune, Walter Davis Jr., Gypsy. He called Gypsy, the tune Gypsy, and then he just turned around to me and said, "Play," like just solo, like one of those opening solos. And I was like, "Well, Art, I don't really know this tune." He said, "Just play, John." And so I started playing my feeble little solo, and he walked back over to the drums, lit a cigarette. He's watching me, you know, dig my hole deeper and deeper. Then he nods for me to stop, and he takes over with his drum solo. And he plays his famous lead in, and I looked down at the chair where I had put the chart for Gypsy, and he had turned over all my music and turned it upside down. And then on the break in the dressing room, he goes, "All right, fellas, how's everybody doing? Everybody playing?" I said, "John ain't playing, he's reading." He said, "You know, the windows are the eyes are the window to the soul. And if you've got your eyes in a piece of paper, you know, well, then you're not, I guess your soul's not coming through."
All right, that's kind of true sometimes.
Yeah.
So Q&A, I just saw there was a notice at the bottom there.
The head to the caravan, the arrangement of that was so intricate. Like, you know, it was like.
And Freddie messed it up too. Freddie got a little lost.
Yeah.
Was that Freddie's arrangement or
No, Cedar Walton's, I think.
Cedars?
Yeah. Was Cedar I think Wayne was still the musical director.
Wayne was the music director, but Cedar brought in a lot of music, and so did Freddie. Yeah. Everybody wanted to bring in their own tunes. They think about royalties, you know, that's always an incentive too.
Yeah. You know, Wayne told me a story about that era. He said that they had played a gig, and afterwards they're sitting around after the gig, and Art says, "By the way, we got a session tomorrow, a recording session tomorrow morning." Everybody show up at Rudy Van Gelder's.
He did that to every band. He did that just about every band he had. "Oh yeah, we got a record session. I want you to bring a couple of tunes."
Yeah, part 2, bring a couple of tunes. There's a lot of spontaneity in those bands.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I want to answer a question that actually Reggie posed when we were putting this together. Reggie's question was, what was Art's message? And I've thought about that quite a bit since Reggie posed the question. I would say, number one, the message is the music. But I would say there's a subtext to that as well, that Art's message, and he said this frequently, he would say to audiences, ladies and gentlemen, no America, no jazz. So his message was that this art form was a uniquely African-American art form that went out all over the world. And, you know, I was just reading Gerald Walker, who talked about it in his early writings of African-American literature. He kind of wrote a lot about slavery and white supremacy and racism and oppression. And until one of his teachers pulled his coattails and he said, you know, there's a lot of that stuff written, but you know, those are the dragons. And he said, there's not enough written about the swords that were forged to fight those dragons and the heroes. And I think that's exactly what Art Blakey was. He was a hero of this music and of the African-American experience. And his sword was his music.
Yep, I agree.
We're going to take some audience questions in a minute. I just want to say, going back to, you know, what's his message, you know, Art would tell lots of stories like, you know, tall tales or whatever. There was a tall tale that was told about Art, which was that, you know, there's a funeral and the minister who's presiding over the funeral, like an interment, says, like, you know, does anybody have any last words to say about the deceased? And it's, you know, it goes quiet. Art pulls up, gets out his car, walks up, says, if nobody has anything to say, I want to talk about jazz, you know.
I'd like to say a few words about jazz. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, you know, very much like what he would get on the bandstand and proselytize and talk about, you know, how, you know, jazz was like, you know, unique, the America's unique art form and blah blah blah. Yeah. So so let's get Reggie in here with some audience questions and see what you guys got.
Hey, Reg.
All right. How's everybody? Man, I've been loving the conversation. Thank you guys for illuminating, you know, so much for us.
Reggie, just let me say, your piece was fantastic. That was great.
That was Brett Martin.
But you told it, and I almost wanted to shut off my camera after that because that was a tough act to follow.
Well, like you say, man, Mr. Blakey's work pushes you.
Yeah.
Like, you know, you got to keep up and try to find some spaces in between. So I have a couple of questions, some from the audience and some from others. So I guess I'd like to start off with Bill first. How did being music director of the Art Blakey and Jazz Messengers affect the way that you approached leading your own bands?
Well, it wasn't so much that. I learned how to be a music director by observing the other guys before me, which was primarily Bobby Watson and James Williams to a lesser degree. But just being around Art and knowing, learning how to call a good set, because that was a big deal with us, if you could call a good set. And sometimes everybody got a chance to do that, not just the music director. But just being a part of the band and just seeing how we interacted with one another and the reverence that everybody in the band, when it was time to get serious about the music, it was very serious. We always had a good time, but when it was time to if the music wasn't right, then we had to correct that. And so I just learned how, basically, I mean, I went to school, so I know a little bit about that, but in terms of deference and reverence, that's what you kind of learn a little bit. But don't take this music lightly and don't play it cheap, because it's not about that. This music is reflective of a pretty deep culture, one of the deepest cultures in America, and we can't let it be trivialized and made into something that it's really not about. This is a reflection of a great many people and a great deal of blood, sweat, and tears. So I learned that about our art was like that about many things, but he didn't always articulate it that way. He always he would laugh it off until you really got him ticked off. Then he'd really let you know how you really felt. You know, but yeah, I learned a lot from being from being the music director, and just observing the other ones in front of me. And actually, now that I remember, actually, I observed Wynton. Wynton was made the music director before me, because that's right. When Bobby was no longer the music director, it became Wynton. And Wynton had his own way. He was different than Bobby's, but Wynton was a perfectionist, and I kind of learned to embrace that in a way that nobody before had been overtly been that way. And so Wynton was really demanding, because not just because of his classical background, I think it's just because of who he was and where he came from, and his father, and the culture of New Orleans as well. So yeah, I learned a lot. I learned quite a bit from Mr. Marcellus. People don't really get it about him, but he's a perfectionist, and he's a real champion of the music.
The Messenger started off as a collective, and that collective spirit kind of seems like it persisted through the decade. Huh?
Always a part of it.
Yes. Yeah. We have an audience question who wants to ask you, both of you, I guess John and Billy, about the Blues March. He said, can you talk about Blues March? It could have been, he says, it could have been done so hokey, and I'm sure it is when some middle school bands play it.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But Art made it swing.
Yeah.
Any insight about that? And I wish we could cue it up for you. It's about, maybe we could, maybe we'll see. But if you could talk about that, maybe give us a sort of idea about it.
It's that hypnotic jazz shuffle that Billy mentioned earlier, the one we heard with Monin and Vitidos too, is actually very close to the beat.
The shuffle.
Yeah, but Art had two shuffles.
Yeah.
One kind of emphasized beats 2 and 4, like the 4, and then the Blues March one emphasized all 4 beats. And both of those are so infectious, if that's the right word. I mean, if it doesn't make you move your body, then there's something wrong with you. Because
Art did say, if you feel like tapping your feet, tapping your toes, tapping.
You got to do more than tap your toes. When he would play those shuffles, you want to stand up and shake your tail feather, because that was the whole thing with those things. They were so hypnotic, and that's what made them groove so hard, was that he hardly played any variation to either of those shuffles. He just 4 beats relentlessly, right? And it got good to you. It was so Blues March, and even his little intro to that is kind of unique, I think, to any of the marches I've ever heard. I think it may have been something in his background that he heard at some point, but it wasn't a typical march, because it had a lot of triplets in it too.
Right.
And so only Art Blakey could put that kind of stamp on it and make it.
As I said, some of his stuff is in hip hop, man. Tribe Called Quest, Diggable Planets. When I was coming up, and I didn't even know it was Art Blakey stuff, and I'm just hearing it, right?
James Williams piece.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful, beautiful stuff, man. And I'm just like grooving to it, like, oh, this is it. This is the hip hop I've been waiting for. Yeah. And I get older and start doing some digging in. I'm like, oh man, this is where this is coming out of. Yeah. And it reminds me of something, not reminds me, but it puts me in a mind of what Miles Davis said. He said once, and somebody called Art Blakey old fashioned. He said, if Art Blakey's old fashioned, I'm white.
I want to go back to Blues March for just a minute with a story. It's before my time, before your time, but when they first went to Japan, the Messengers, and again, that would have been like 1959. There was a jazz appreciation club in Japan. Akira Jin was the president of that, and they did a poll, like, who do you want to bring? They wanted to bring Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. It was the first American jazz band, professional jazz band. It wasn't like army band or something to play in Japan. and they were on a plane, and they were not the only celebrities on the plane. There was like Hollywood stars like Shirley MacLaine was on the plane. And when they landed in Japan, now the messenger is back, it's still the 1950s coming off of that. They were not always treated well in the United States. When they got off the plane, there are all these women with like flowers and stuff. And they didn't realize it was for them, and then, when they got down on the tarmac, the sound system was playing Blues March. And it was like a really transformative experience for them, because it was like, a trip abroad where they were really embraced. They were on national TV. It was like a transformative experience. And Blues March was like the soundtrack to that when they got off the plane.
One time we played in a really small town in really North Scandinavia, way up there. And I remember I don't know where it was. Might have been Tromsø.
It was above the Arctic Circle. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. But I remember walking, I don't know if it was those particular gigs, but I remember walking to the plane once, and a bunch of the passengers behind us started whistling Blues March.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Maybe. And I thought that was just so, I was like, wow, that's something else,
Yeah.
But Boo's reach was pretty far and pretty deep, because those gigs above the Arctic Circle were like way up there. I remember that was pretty odd, to say the very least. But
you know what? I'm glad some Eric brought that up, man, about Blues March. So now some of us out there are going to have to go and do our homework and dig into it. We can't be playing everything for y'all. You know what I'm saying? You're going to have to go and check the stuff out yourself. Yeah, I want to ask you a question, being his nephew. I understand. Is it true that Art Blakey not only was this killer drummer, but he also messed around a little bit with piano?
He started off on piano. So he at a very young age left home and was playing in a joint in Pittsburgh, where he was from. And so he started off on the piano, and a young cat came in and auditioned for piano and blew him off the keyboard. It was Errol Garner, a very young Errol Garner. And Art, so Art used to tell the story. He said that the club owner like pulled out an automatic and told him, "You're going to play the drums." Like, he didn't want to play the drums, so he said he got up there and he's been up on the drum set ever since. But yeah, I did hear him play once. He played a monk tune, and he had chops, huh?
Thelonious is the name of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I always played his tune Thelonious. Yeah.
Yeah. You could hear that he had it in him.
Yeah.
And it probably informed his drumming too, because his drumming was very melodic. I mean, piano and drums are part of the rhythm section, so he just moved from one part of the rhythm section to another.
In his latter years, he carried a fake book with him all the time, and he would sometimes sit down and kind of plunk away.
Yeah.
And he always said he couldn't read music, but he had his fake book, and he would he could decipher a little bit. He could figure it out.
Oh man.
Yeah.
You learned something new about that cat tonight.
Yeah. I was gonna ask, maybe I'll go to ask a question for John. And maybe this is obvious, but maybe there's some nuance to it that you might be able to pull out of that. How did have a history of playing and traveling with Blakey really inform your book on Art's drumming style? Were you watching him all the time? Were you closing eyes and just hearing ghost licks? What was it? Was it a visual thing as well as a sonic thing that affected you and how you wrote your book?
Yeah, thank you, Reggie, because that actually reminds me that I wanted to say that Art showed me the world. I mean, at the time Billy and I were in the band, I think we probably went to Europe 7 or 8 times. We went to the Caribbean, to Guadeloupe and Martinique, the French Caribbean. We went to Japan. We went to Greenland. I mean, and I'm talking about multiple trips. We drove across the United States at least 2 or 3 times. You remember those trips, Bill, I'm sure.
Oh, Lord, yes.
We drove from New York to Florida, from Florida to Texas, from Texas to LA, from LA to Seattle, from Seattle to Reno, from Reno to Detroit. And, I mean, Art really literally showed me the world. Funny story, the first time we went on a transatlantic flight on with the big band, we're sitting in the airplane. I'm sitting next to Art, and the guys are around, and Art did one of his, "Hey fellas, look at John, he's scared." First time on a big airplane, right? And he said, "John, don't worry about a thing. Everywhere I go, I got two angels, one on each shoulder. The only place they don't go is in the shit house." Excuse my English. However, as far as the specific to your question, as the road manager, I had notebooks where I kept things like band draws, because the band was always drawing money to, whatever they needed money. If I gave money to Billy Pierce, I'd write Billy Pierce $50, Charles Fan. So I had a notebook, but Art would have played probably 52 weeks out of a year if he could have. But
Yeah.
very, very often he played 45, 50 weeks a year. He was always on the road. Sometimes, 4 or 5 nights a week, one-nighters here and there. And so my job as road manager was really, it's a faceted job. You're the road manager, you're the driver, you're the sound man, you're the MC, you're the MD sometimes. I mean, that job was, road manager doesn't really describe it. But because I was always at the side of the stage in case something went wrong with the drums, a hi-hat broke or something, or the sound system somebody needed a monitor, I was always right backstage with my notebooks, literally writing drum notation to things that Art did. So, that was my way to remember, but also my way to document, understand what it was he played. So I had like two notebooks by the time I'd finished road managing, a little over 2.5 years or so. And they were full of Art's personal signature drum fills or figures that he played. So that's what enabled me to write the book, was to talk about literacy, being able to notate rhythm. It was, and he always said, "John, we got to write that book. We got to write that. Hey, Art, let's do it." Unfortunately, he never lived to see it, but it got done, and that's how it came about.
Yawu, thank you, John. Yawu, when you listen to contemporary artists, who are influenced by Blakey, his hard bop style of jazz, and maybe I'm going to ask Bill and John, maybe Bill, to hold forth on what hard bop is. I like to have maybe a little bit of a walk through that. When you hear this kind of stuff, hard bop jazz, does it which ones do you choose? Of the music influenced by Blakey, which one do you think that you pull to the most?
I mean, I listen like at different points in history. Like I'll go back and listen to like stuff from the 60s as well as contemporary stuff. No one person in particular. I feel like everybody's got the DNA of, like any drummer has like some DNA from Art, some DNA from Elvin Jones, it's all kind of mixed up. And it's like you can't really sort of compare or say this person is like I've certainly heard John or Ralph Peterson, the late Mr. Peterson, do Art licks and sort of like, listen to the tribute bands and enjoy that. But, beyond the tribute bands, like, I think it's like everybody's got their own style.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And Bill, I was want to ask you about, maybe you can give us a little take on what people mean when they say hard bop.
Not really sure, to be honest. I think that was just a description that writers gave, and it seemed to be centered around Art and Horace. And for some reason, they called it hard bop, but then they said it was funky, but it still had the elements of what Bird played. So that's why it never really made a lot of sense to me. But essentially, it's a continuation of the developments of modern music or modern jazz, if you want to even use that terminology, that started or in the 58 on. But essentially, it was still a continuation of what Bird and Diz did, but just in some ways, which kind of is at odds with the name hard bop, it was almost like a making the music a little bit more accessible, because I mean, moaning, blues march, shuffles and stuff like that, which Art really did a lot of. Everybody likes the blues and everybody likes the shuffle. So I've never quite understood what it meant, but I think it was just a continuation of what Bird and Diz did more than anything. It was just something that some writer came up with, but it stuck.
You know, the closest sort of correlation I can think of to the term hard, and I do kind of associate that term hard bop specifically with Art, but Art again would always tell his audiences, ladies and gentlemen, bring some of your square friends, take them out to hear some jazz, and make sure it's hardcore jazz. So there's the hard part of it, hardcore, and you know, it could also mean hard swinging. You know, it just
yeah, that would make sense, but I never understood it myself.
Yeah, I mean. Guy of
as somebody who's written about jazz, I learned, like, you know, just from asking cats, like, you know, how would you categorize your music? They're like, I don't categorize it. What kind of jazz you play? I just play a music. You know, you talk to Nicholas Payton, he's like, it's just Black American music, you know? So yeah, I just, you know, those terms are for the writers to try to like put the music in boxes, which is what we do, which is what I do, like in my mind. You know, but,
right. I guess this goes to both Bill and John as far as teaching. Both of y'all have a treasure trove of stories about Art, and both of you were mentored by him. You know, is there any story that you sort of relate to your students that you find yourself continuing going back to that you think has some sort of pedagogical heft?
I guess that's the commitment. If you think you want to be a jazz musician, be committed to it, and understand that there's, you know, it's going to be tough.
So if you want to be a jazz musician, you need to be committed.
Yeah, you need to. That's a good way of putting it. But other than that, you're probably not going to succeed if you're not committed to the music. If the music comes first, if you're thinking about having your name up in lights and album covers or album covers or CD covers, or no,
remember those?
Don't even have CDs anymore.
Postcards or something.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. If that's what your objective is, then you probably should try to do something else. But if you love the music and the music won't allow you to do something else, then you, by all means, do it. But also have a broad sort of skill set just to be able to do whatever you need to do to survive and go forward. But more than the commitment to the music, there's nothing I could really impart to people. Unless there's a drummer, then I'd say, you know, it doesn't feel good. You know, if it doesn't feel good, what's the point? You know,
right.
It's one thing about Art and even Tony Williams and all of the masters. There's a feeling and there's a bounce and in most guys, there's a danceability or a danceable feeling in the way they play. It's not always the case. Not everybody's like that, and it's still compelling. But generally, it's really about the feeling, and that's what you ask any older musician, and I guess that includes me now. It's really about the feeling. It's about the feeling, because if you're playing music that's devoid of feeling, what's the point?
Right. Right. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
John, you pass on any bon mot or any story in particular that you pass on about him that you find particularly useful to your students?
Well, certainly the one about you don't have to prove anything. All you got to do is swing. But along the same vein as what Billy's talking about, I think most of us would say that music chose us. We didn't choose music, but if students are so inclined to want to be performers, I would often, caution them that, if you want to make your living at playing, at the very best, that's going to be a fluctuating income. And that's just the reality of it. Probably even more so now than past years. But that, yeah, you know, now there's this entrepreneurial concept where you'll do a little of this and a little of that, you know, teaching, have a home studio. So, you know, there's always that conversation for the guys that really want to play, unless they're, you know, they're fortunate enough to be the, you know, the Antonio Sanchez's or the John Blackwells of the world. I don't know, the top 1/10 of the 1% who get those gigs with Prince or you know, Pat Metheny or whoever. That, you know, it's a lot better than a fluctuating income. But those are few and far between, I think. And you know, there's some great players that they're living paycheck to paycheck and wondering where they're gonna get rent from. So
right. Well, so I'll end it because we're about to come up on 8:30. But I want to, being a person of the word, a poet, I want to ask maybe you three gentlemen to give me a metaphor or a simile about Art Blakey, right? Maybe I'll ask you two to be like, to say playing with Art Blakey was like.
Wow. Well, it's really
thinking something too, Yawu, being his nephew was like, you know, keep it clean, y'all.
Well, for me, it was like being born, you know, because not only the way Mr. Blakey played and how he made you feel, the panic as well as the exhilaration, but the fact that you were playing with Art Blakey, he made me feel like I was a musician. He really made me feel like I had arrived and I had achieved something. And because I got to play with Art Blakey for 3 years, that, you know, it gave me a confidence that I didn't have before.
Cool.
I'd say the same thing. There was a certain validation I got from Art that he would bestow upon me from time to time, and he would make comparisons. He said, you know, the thing about you and me is our sound. And things like that. But I would also say that it was like being around an American griot. He was like the American griot, and there's so much to be gotten from that. Yeah, it was a great experience. One I'll cherish forever.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, just listening to him. Yeah, just listening to him, going to see his gigs was like stepping into a river of Black musical history, like, you know, because he went back so long with Mary Lou Williams, Fletcher Henderson, Billy Eckstine, like all that came out in his playing, and you know, and then the cats who came through his band and are still playing today, like you just, you know, really the sense I have is of you know, really being in that river of music, like, you know, just as a listener, as a spectator, as a consumer. But yeah, it's just it was an incredible experience. Still today, listening to him, watching his videos, you know, yeah, it's just it's such an amazing experience.
Wow. Well, we want to thank all of you for being a part of this, whether you are a jazz aficionado or novice. I am sure you learned something today or tonight. I'd like to thank our moderator, Mr. Yawu Miller, for his adept handling of both the interview and the audience. You know, I knew you could fill them out there even if you couldn't ask their questions. I'd like to also thank our two Jazz Messenger Big Band alumni, educator and saxophonist Bill Pierce, and also author and second drummer of that band, John Ramsay. Once again, my name is Reggie Gibson, and on behalf of the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington, we wish you all a good evening and an even better tomorrow. And to ensure that you have a better tomorrow, we are going to send you out with a little bit of wisdom from Mr. Art Blakey. And everybody, have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Art Blakey, Jazz Messengers. Big hand for Art Blakey, the Jazz Messengers. All right, cooking with jazz.
late 1950s and early 1960s, there was a lot of good music coming out of America in the field of jazz.
Still a lot of good music coming out of America.
Well, I thought maybe you'd like to comment on what happened at that period when rock and roll came on the scene.
Nothing happened. You got to understand, there's always going to be jazz. I don't say there will always be rock, because they got them so they can computer it. But that's just the notes. Where is the feeling?
No.
I'm out.
All right.
Nailed
Everybody,
it.
you have a good evening.
All right.
And
see you
remember,
guys. Take
always
care.
find the feeling.
Find the feeling. There you go. All right.